The producers very kindly approached me, I think because I'm a bit of a skeptic, because I'm not particularly religious. It's a topic that is so interesting. They asked me if I would like to go on the journey of a lifetime. How could I refuse?
So now I have this dossier with lots of documents in, and I'm not given too much information because together we're all going to explore this. But I have looked at a sort of an overview of where we're going, and if this transpires to be true, it's going to be life-changing for all of us.
It is claimed that now over 100 events have seen fulfillment with deadly accuracy.
Tumultuous events are beginning to take place. Things are beginning to assemble that can place the human race in a situation it's never quite been in before in the same way to the same degree, but most people are so captivated by their own world and their own self-interest, their own pursuits, they're not seeing what's really happening, the gathering storm. There have been several major points in history where people thought the end of the world was impending and biblical prophecies were being fulfilled, but the world did not end. This time, it's different. The missing ingredient the previous times was Israel. That's no longer missing. The question is it real? Is it actual? Is it so? If it's real, if it's accurate, if it is so, its consequences become unavoidable to you. These events that are overtaking the contemporary world, particularly focused on the Middle East, will be universally cataclysmic if the scriptures are correct. It will affect everyone on the planet, either directly or indirectly in some way. The consequences will be inescapable. You need to know what it means for you. The same as there were people who understood the events of the time in Daniel's day, there will be people in that character in the last days who will do the same thing. They'll be able to understand. But we're warned by Daniel, none of the wicked will understand. We're also warned by Daniel, there will be an escape.
So, on that sobering thought, let's proceed. I'm now going to read our first three prophetic events. Israel will be dispersed, despised, and regathered. And these particular events are apparently a sign to the world. The apocalyptic countdown has begun.
As Jesus warned, as Daniel predicted, the Romans would destroy Jerusalem and Jews became evicted progressively in the 1st and 2nd century from Jerusalem and from the area of southern Israel. They were dispersed far and wide, certainly throughout Europe, Asia, even into Africa and into the New World. This happened.
Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations, from one end of the earth to the other. Among those nations you will find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of your life.
History has been plagued by anti-Semitism towards the Jews. This hatred of the Jews, we hate you. Jews were persecuted in every nation in which they lived. It's not even logical. And it is predicted in the Torah of the Jews, in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28 and Leviticus chapter 26, that these things would happen to the Jews. And the ugly history of anti-Semitism is foretold there. Isaiah wrote about this acutely, and Jesus, in no uncertain terms, spoke of the fact that they would have to come back to the land and to their capital. It was predicted, and it happened.
It says in Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 21, this is God speaking, and I will take the children of Israel from among the nations, wherever they have gone, and will gather them from every side and bring them back into their own land. Now, the point of this passage is there's never been a point in history where the Jews have been gathered back to the land of Israel and been given back their land and given back their nationhood from all the nations round about, except in 1948.
How can this nation be reborn in a day? How can the Jews go back to this ancient capital after being scattered among the nations for nearly 2 millennia? The scriptures said that would happen. When you see the Jews back in the land of Israel and back in their ancient capital of Jerusalem, according to the New Testament, that is a sign of the end.
This is Rabbi Richman, and he says, if you had told a Jew who was about to enter the gas chamber that Israel would soon become a nation again, and that the Jews would be on the other side of the gun for the first time in 2,000 years, you would not have had to put him in it, because he would have died laughing. For them, this was impossible, for they were a people with no hope. So we've looked at the prophecies of dispersion, and certainly there's every evidence to show that the Jews were dispersed from Israel. We've looked at them being despised. Adolf Hitler doing his very best to get rid of every Jew on the planet, hating them with a passion. Why?
The head of Hezbollah says, if all the Jews gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of going after them worldwide.
Why do people hate them? Why is there such a strong anti-Semitic movement in the world? And the regathering, of course. 1948 sees the rebirth of Israel. It's interesting how the prophecies seem to be pretty accurate. This is a prophecy from Zechariah, and it's about 2,500 years old. And in the day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all peoples. All who lift it or burden themselves with it shall be sorely wounded, and all the nations of the earth shall come and gather together against it.
And though we were facing a major catastrophe, and the feeling was that the experiment of establishing a Jewish state was about to come to an end, someone from above had other plans. And within 6 days we managed to overcome our enemies in each and every one of our borders and to reunite Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people, the capital of the state of Israel, but the capital of God in the world, as was announced 3,000 years ago by King David.
So, despite the huge resources of the Syrian, Egyptian and Jordanian military against a very tiny, limited Israeli army, Jerusalem fell back into Israeli hands in 1967 to become the capital of Israel again, even though the rest of the world would insist that Israel's capital is Tel Aviv.
Jerusalem is not a settlement, it's our capital.
Moving on, Zephaniah, and this is taken from about 622 BC. Then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Lord, to serve him with one accord.
When I ask you, Ma shmech, what is your name? I speak to you in biblical language. Yeah, maybe you can say that this is a miracle. You brought people from all corners of the earth, speaking, I don't know how many dozens of languages into one country, and you revived this beautiful sleeping beauty into a language of use.
The dossier also tells me about another prediction by the prophet Ezekiel.
some 2,600 years ago, and says that in the last days the ancient Jewish currency of the shekel will be revived. And guess what? Dispersed, despised, regathered with Jerusalem as its capital, language restored, and of course the shekel. All predicted, all true. So you can look at this two ways right now. We could say it's a bunch of coincidences, or we can go further and think, is there actually something in this? What do you think? Let's find out more. Nearly 3,000 years ago, the prophet Isaiah predicted that water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. This is Isaiah 740 BC. I will set pines in the wasteland, the fir and the cypress together. In days to come, Israel will take root. She will bud and blossom and fill the world with fruit. They will say, this land that was laid waste has become like the Garden of Eden. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom.
Every prophecy is a powerful sign, a warning marker for the skeptic. From wasteland to Garden of Eden, the land will be transformed. It was predicted, and it happened. These are all predicted by the Hebrew prophets. When the restoration of the nation would take place, there would be a national reforestation, and Israel would become an agricultural producing nation. For the centuries when the Jews were not in control, the land was largely barren. When the Zionists first came here, it was largely either malarial-infested swamp or else desert. In fact, the Turks imposed a tax on the growth of trees. Well, once Israel became a nation in 1948, there was an intense national program of national reforestation, literally fulfilling this prophecy. And of course, Israel is the garden of the Middle East. You don't find so much agricultural land recovered from a desert wilderness anywhere else in the Middle East. Other nations would like to have it, but Israel has made the deserts blossom just as was predicted.
The mountains will drip with sweet wine. All the hills shall flow. I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. We see that happening now. Israel shall blossom and bud and fill the face of the world with fruit.
The transformation is remarkable, but it's come about because of a lot of hard graft from people working in kibbutzes over the last 40 years and financial investment and grown-up irrigation systems that have been put into place and so on, all of which every other country, given the finances in that region, could achieve. The spooky thing is, only Israel has managed to get itself together in this capacity. Now, is that just something that would happen because they're a smart nation, or is it because it was foretold? So, Israel is in place again. Jerusalem is at the heart of everything, and the land is blossoming. And my dossier tells me the predictions we're going to look at now are events that have been happening for many, many years. However, what gives these signs greater importance is that in the latter or last days, these specific events will increase in intensity and destructive force.
The scriptures speak of 4 kinds of calamity that will take place as we approach the end of the age. The first is largely environmental. Things such as natural disasters, pestilence, famines, things of this nature, increases of disease, food shortages, and so forth.
So according to the prophecies, we will see an increase in catastrophes. Well, I don't think anyone here would disagree with the things that have been happening. You only need to turn on your television and you'll see footage of floodings, tsunamis, earthquakes. It seems all too common. In fact, so much so, I think in the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen so much television footage of these natural disasters that you're kind of used to it. It's not shocking anymore.
The other category are wars and rumors of wars, catastrophes that are man-made, most of them based on ethnic tensions between ethnic nations.
You will hear of wars and rumours of wars. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, earthquakes, signs in the sun, moon and stars. Nations will be in anguish at the roaring and tossing of the sea. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world. Such things must happen. All these are the beginning of birth pains. So that means more natural disasters, more often. And it seems like we're seeing evidence of that now.
Changes in society will trigger the final events where there will be no turning back. It was predicted, and it is happening.
Lawlessness, moral decline, and the greed is good culture.
There are ambiguous prophecies in the New Testament concerning an increase in lawlessness that will take place in the last days.
There will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure.
Now that Western society has become increasingly post-Christian and neo-pagan, we find that with that trend, there is a trend towards the decline of established moral values.
Child abuse, granny rape, the drug culture, mindless crimes.
But again, it's ambiguous. It applies to what happens in society generally, but also what happens within the Christian church.
Okay, taking a look at these predictions, I'm beginning to understand how indeed these prophecies are integrated. It requires one event to precede the next, and they build upon each other to make the bigger picture. So next on the list is spiritual deception, which is apparently one of the greatest signs that the end is closing in.
Mass spiritual delusion will captivate millions as they seek signs and wonders, opening a door for the greatest delusion of all time. It was predicted, and it is happening.
Over the years, there's been an increase in the number of people that have contacted Reach Out Trust that feel they have been deceived by some churches that they went to, by some groups that they thought were Christian and were not. And they found that in the end, it's not the truth as they were told it to be. And as we began to investigate and look at this, we found it very interesting that the Bible talks about a period of time, the end of the age. And it says that in this period of time, at the end of the age, this very deception that these people have is going to increase.
The thing reiterated by Jesus the most was undoubtedly deception within the Christian church. Again, the false teachers, the false prophets, even false messiahs.
Over the years, Reach Out Trust has seen an increase in the falling away of people within churches from true Christianity. They've moved away from biblical truth.
Something has happened in recent years. The traditional gospel message has been maligned, even discredited by televangelists. Born again has become a household joke associated with religious con artistry. Unfortunately, people will tend to dismiss the traditional Christian message because of this financial con artistry that's conspicuous to everybody, ignoring the fact that Jesus himself warned it was going to happen. Many would come in his name and lead many people astray. This is something the scriptures speak of as the great apostasy, the departure from the truth.
The coming of this lawless one will be in accordance with the work of Satan displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs and wonders.
But who's he warning? He's warning people who claim to be Christians, who should know better. We are seeing an apostasy. We are seeing whole denominations that at one time were biblically based and held to a biblical morality, having gone into everything from not simply religious apostasy, but even moral debauchery and a fundamental lack of financial ethics.
I had no idea that people within the church were no longer really studying the Bible, which, as I said to Dr. Biro, I thought was their main book of rules, if you like. So if people aren't studying the Bible and are not knowing what it's saying, they're therefore relying on preachers who are preaching whatever seems to be on their mind and important to them on that day.
As the world strains under the weight of humanitarian issues, mankind will desperately seek a leader, a savior. It was predicted, but will it happen?
But it is clear to all concerned when it comes to nuclear weapons, we have reached a decisive point. This is not simply about America's interests. It's about preventing a nuclear arms race in the Middle East that could lead this region and the world down a hugely dangerous path.
There will be a convergence of calamities, environmental, economic, political, and strategic, taking place, much of it centered in the Middle East. In desperation, the world will look to a political leader and a religious leader as some kind of a redeemer figure. It's curious that as we enter the world we're in now, New Agers are waiting for someone called Maitreya. Muslims are waiting for the Mahdi. Buddhists are waiting for the fifth Buddha. Jews are waiting for the advent of the Messiah. Christians are waiting for the return of Christ. A spiritual counterfeit will come, quite possibly being all things to all people. He will be able to unite the world's faiths with a political agenda, coming as this messianic figure, posing as having a capability of restoring prosperity and stability in an atmosphere of utter chaos that has people terrified. In their terror about what's transpiring environmentally, what's transpiring strategically and economically, they will look to a man instead of to God, and they'll get one. This is the one the New Testament calls the man of sin, the Antichrist, and he will come to power assisted by a corrupted global religious system.
He, the Antichrist, also forced everyone, small or great, rich or poor, free or slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark. Revelation 20, verse 4. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony for Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received his mark on their foreheads or their hands. Let's watch a film.
The scriptures speak of a new kind of currency that will take place, some would suggest in the form of some kind of a microchip on the forehead or on the right hand, by which people will be able to buy and sell, but not be able to buy and sell without it. Increasingly, financial institutions are looking to new technologies to cope with this problem of finding a means of currency that will function the way credit cards do, but will not be a credit card. That will not be something that which you can easily counterfeit or easily defraud someone with. Well, obviously, implantation is the direction these technologies are generally taking.
The next revolution, unquestionably, is going to be nanotechnology. That's the ability to create structures that will manipulate matter at the atomic or molecular level. The way that could manifest is in various small chips, turning human beings into walking technology.
Implantation is already beginning to take place experimentally on humans. The essential technology already exists. Well, the book of Revelation tells us that will be a final currency. No one will be able to buy and sell without it.
Whoever controls that technology will ultimately, fundamentally control our lives. And it is very much a case that ultimately it'll be government that does control and run all of those technologies. We see now, particularly with governments nationalizing various industries, regulating various industries, they will have control, and those technologies will dominate and control our lives and can be used for nefarious purposes.
So we've really got to examine whether these prophecies that were made, let's not forget, over 2,000 years ago, is the technology there when they were talking about, Jacob was talking about the mark being on the right hand or on the forehead, the mark being a potential microchip containing your banking details, so your credit card or your credit history, and your ability to buy and sell. Well, when you examine it like this, you think, well, this is the technology is unquestionably there. I have 2 dogs; they're both chipped. The wherewithal is there. It's a relatively simple process, and it certainly can happen. It may probably be happening in test sites around the world as we speak. Scary to think about it. And another thing that crosses my mind is it's clearly stated that it's the right hand. Why would it be the right hand? What significance is that? And if you don't play ball with these people, you get your head chopped off. In what part of the world would that happen? Does that happen? Certainly worth thinking about.
Many will strive for peace in the Middle East, yet prophecy indicates Russia, Iran, Turkey, and others will war with Israel. It was predicted, but will it happen? Both the book of Revelation and the prophet Daniel speak of this last 7 years of human history being divided into 2 halves. At the onset of this 7-year period, a peace treaty proposing to bring peace to the Middle East between Israel and the nations surrounding it will be inaugurated, which will be broken halfway through by this person whom we call the Antichrist. This person who's going to come, try to persuade the Jews he is some kind of a deliverer figure and bring a peace to the Middle East, but he will also not simply deceive Israel. He will deceive the nations. He will come as a man of peace, but he'll actually be a man of war. Daniel also predicted that when these events do transpire, we are going to see Persia, that is Iran, emerging as a strategic threat to Israel's existence, leading up to some kind of a terrible conflict.
Today, an unprecedented threat to humanity looms large. A radical Iranian regime, armed with nuclear weapons, could bring an end to the era of nuclear peace that the world has enjoyed for the last 65 years.
You've got the Israelis with nuclear weapons. They're unlikely to use them, I would say, first, but they might get into a threatened situation and then find that it's very difficult not to use them.
If you had a situation in which Israel went to war with Iran, how is Iran going to respond? Well, it's going to respond through its proxies. And this is where you wind up with a global catastrophe.
Why would Russia align itself with Iran when Russia itself is afraid of what Iran represents, Islamic fundamentalism? It does not seem to make any strategic sense or any logical sense, except that Russia could see Iran as a mechanism to bring about such an instability in the Middle East where Arab oil would no longer be reliable and the value of Russian oil and natural gas would go through the roof, making Russia the new Saudi Arabia. That is one possible explanation some people have cited. Whatever explanation you wish to give to what seems to be illogical behavior by Russia, by arming Iran, by giving it certain kinds of technologies, one thing is for sure. We are told by Ezekiel, Russia, Turkey, and certainly the nations of Soviet Central Asia, as it was once known, will come into some kind of a military confederation with Iran in order to invade Israel, but it will fail due to divine intervention that will in part involve natural disasters.
So the prophecies seem to be quite accurate. Spooky. Is this all a coincidence? I'm thinking not. I don't know what you think.
The constellation of global events are almost complete. The predictions are a clear, visible sign.
Right, our next chapter. A mountain splits water from under a great temple, a gate sealed. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley. On that day living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half to the Dead Sea and half to the Mediterranean Sea.
The Hebrew prophet Isaiah said the return of the Messiah would actually commence in southern Jordan around the rock fortress city of Petra, but the Messiah would stand on the Mount of Olives. This exactly echoes what is said in the New Testament. When Jesus ascended from the Mount of Olives, he would return in the same way to the same location. And the Mount of Olives would split, presumably at the cleft where there's a known fissure. It's also predicted that water would come from underneath a water table in Jerusalem and flow in the direction of the Dead Sea.
My name is Usher Alchel. I've been working in the site of the city of David for almost 10 years. I'm an archaeologist trained at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Israel is situated along the Syro-African Rift, the fault line that separates between Europe and Africa. Earthquakes have affected this region from antiquity. The prophets talk about how, in the end of days, an earthquake will split Mount Olives in half, and the waters of Jerusalem, like these below us, will both flow to the Dead Sea and to the Mediterranean. But where we are now, as we said, earthquakes have affected this region and have the potential of changing its topography.
The man brought me back to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple towards the east.
There will have to be a rebuilding of the temple in the book of Revelation, chapter 11, as it were a tribulational temple. It'll have to happen. And as we speak, there are yeshivas, Jewish religious schools, dedicated to resurrecting the ancient Levitical priesthood. There's a temple institute that is in the process of collecting, restoring, designing the artifacts necessary to reintroduce Levitical worship. It's underway even as we speak.
Then the man, an angel, brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, the one facing east, and it was shut. The Lord said to me, "This gate is to remain shut."
We have a prophecy in the book of Ezekiel that the east gate would be, as it were, blocked up or plugged up. Suleiman the Magnificent, understanding the Jewish belief that the Messiah would come through the east gate, put a cemetery in front of it because Jews would be ritually defiled had they tried to enter through the east gate via a cemetery, having even indirect contact with the corpse. But he also cemented it up, fulfilling this prophecy unbeknownst to him. However, God's Spirit will again enter through that gate at the end of the age. Despite the desires of many people over the centuries really to reopen it, it still remains closed, as Ezekiel prophesied it would. It's entirely visible today, again, opposite the cleft in the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Kidron Valley, in the wall of Jerusalem on the east side of the old city. Still there, just as Ezekiel said.
Ezekiel again. The man brought me back to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple towards the east. This water flows towards the eastern region, and it goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the sea. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the rivers flow. There will be large numbers of fish, because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Okay, so not all of this has come to pass yet. The temple is still to be built, if it's to be built, but certainly looking at it, preparations are very much underway, down to finite detail. It's almost as though they're looking at the prophecies as an instruction manual in terms of what to make for the Messiah. We've seen evidence of water under Jerusalem, so something that was predicted 2,500 years ago seems to be based pretty much on fact. It's all proving to be very, very feasible and very possible, and very spooky that it was predicted 2,500 years ago when they didn't know about fault lines, and we've just seen that Jerusalem is on top of a fault line. Israel didn't exist until 1948, so again, the whole we can't say coincidence. There's something going on here. There's something that is seemingly real about all these prophecies. Moving on, the rise of an Eastern superpower and the construction of a great dam. Jesus speaks in his revelation to the Apostle John. Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates, and the 4 angels who had been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year were released to kill. The number of the mounted troops was 200 million. I heard their number. Another revelation. The 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon.
The scriptures speak of the kings of the East invading the Middle East. Genghis Khan almost attempted this, but never did. It was not the proper time for it to happen. The only nations in the world that could assemble an army of 200 million obviously would be in the Far East. Some have speculated it's Sin, the ancient name for China. Be that as it may, it would have to cross the Euphrates River. Even as we speak, there is a dam in Turkey which could restrict or even block the flow of the waters into the Mesopotamian Delta, the Fertile Crescent, the Euphrates, that could literally make this particular prophecy happen. China is increasingly looking to the Middle East because of oil. I'm not necessarily saying it must be China, but it doesn't leave too many other possibilities. And certainly what we see happening is already beginning to materialize in terms of practical possibility.
In terms of the technology and the dam and the drying of the Euphrates, it's uncannily spooky that could be done now, and again, how that could have been predicted. I don't know, what do you think?
Despite frantic efforts, the world will witness the greatest Holocaust of all time. It was predicted, but will it happen?
Well, here we are. Here's the big one. Armageddon and the day the earth will stand still. Jesus speaks in Revelation 16, verse 16. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Jesus speaks as quoted by Matthew. For then there will be great distress, unequalled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equalled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened.
There are all sorts of ways in which one can cut the cake, if you like. You could say, for example, that the Americans and Russians, between them, possess 97% of the world's nuclear arsenals. In that sense, if there was going to be an accident or some war and all-out nuclear exchange, then it's most likely to be between those two. Out of the states with nuclear weapons, it's very difficult to pin, though I would say of them, Pakistan is probably the biggest problem. But then again, Israel, I haven't mentioned Israel. Israel exists in a very difficult relationship with its neighbours, and although none of its neighbours yet have a nuclear weapon to balance them, and nobody really seriously thinks that Israel will launch nuclear weapons anytime soon, it could very quickly get into some sort of conflict situation where nuclear weapons may come into play. That's more likely the closer Iran gets to acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. And that Iranian-Israeli relationship is one that I think we need to watch over the next few years as a potential spark point.
Jeremiah 25, verse 33. At that time, those slain by the Lord will be everywhere, from one end of the earth to the other. They will not be mourned, or gathered up, or buried, but will be like refuse lying on the ground. I have the vision in my head of millions of slain bodies lying around, whether it's as a result of some massive device, megaton bomb, nuclear bomb. But from what this is saying, it is talking about the whole globe. It's utterly frightening and sadly possible.
We are specifically warned by Jesus that unless he returned, no human flesh would be saved. The human race would bring itself to the point of extinction. Technologically, that was not possible until the 20th century. It is easy to see how if there is a nuclear exchange in even one area of the world, it can easily spill over into a tinderbox effect globally. It was not possible either strategically or technologically up until the 1940s, but it's certainly possible now.
Well, that certainly put a very harrowing image in my head. I don't know about you. We know that the Middle East is a political hotspot. We know the oil is an issue. We know that mankind certainly has created the ability to wipe itself out, with the Russians having something in the region of 13,000 nuclear warheads. The Americans, 9,000. In Britain, we've got something like 160. The technology is there, the firepower is there. It could happen. It could happen. It's an awesome thought. And I'm sure ever since the nuclear bomb was conceived, it's been a fear in the back of everybody's mind, certainly mine. Okay, so far we're only really skimming the surface of what is a truly, truly fascinating subject. I always thought it was going to be fascinating from the moment I was approached to go on this journey. However, coming so far, it's very interesting, it's very scary, and a lot of me's thinking, yeah, how can we stop this? How can we prevent it? I'm not entirely sure whether we can. Well, we've all seen the same thing, and it's fascinating. First of all, we've got to accept whether or not what we've seen is going to come to pass in the future, in the not too distant future from the looks of things. I think there are only two conclusions that you can make. One is that it's all rubbish. It's not true, and it's not going to happen, and therefore we have nothing to worry about. We might as well go off and say, well, that was quite entertaining, and have a good rest of your lives, which is fine. The other is that you accept that this is the future, and then you have to work out how you're going to deal with it, and what you're going to do about it. And that, to me, is the hardest. Easy to walk away. I found this a most amazing journey. Really, really interesting and worrying all at the same time, but it's left me wanting to find out more. I'm now going to leave you in the very capable hands of Jacob.
I want people to examine the evidence and come to a conviction for themselves. I honestly believe, I'm in fact absolutely convinced, that people who will honestly examine the evidence with due consideration will be astounded at the conclusion they will arrive at.